All right, so now we're going to get into the second part of our discussion about community ecology. And we're just going to talk a little bit about community structure. So earlier we talked about different types of relationships between different species. Now we're going to kind of look at all those different relationships simultaneously. Again, just a very brief overview of this idea, but kind of showing you some cool things that we see when we study ecology at this level. And so one thing that you've got to realize, we've talked about the age of the earth and how long things have been evolving. And when you look at community structure, these relationships among all the species in a community, those relationships have been evolving for a long time. And there's tight links in between these species. And so one of the things that we like to point out is that if you just remove or disrupt just a single species, sometimes you can have very enormous effects in the community because of all these tight links that have evolved. And so let's talk about some of those links. For example, we have something called trophic structure. And so that's the feeding relationships between organisms in a community. So we talked about, predator-prey relationships, and that's mostly what we're talking about here. But, who eats whom and how they relate to another. That's some basic community ecology, and it's a basic way that you can look at how a community is structured by its trophic structure. And so here's an example of a couple of very simple food chains, right? You've got a terrestrial food chain on the left and a marine food chain on the right. And each of these different steps is called a trophic level. So we've got the primary producers, and they're eaten by the primary consumers, who are eaten by the secondary consumers, who are eaten by the tertiary consumers, who are eaten by the quaternary consumers. And so you've got in the terrestrial food web, you've got a plant that's eaten by an insect, which is eaten by a carnivore, a shrew or a mouse, which is eaten by a snake, which is eaten by another carnivore. And so we're mostly talking about predator-prey relationships here. And so this is one way that we can look at the basic structure of a community. Now, what's unique about the primary producers? What do we know about the primary producers? Remember earlier we talked about net primary productivity. We talked about the amount of energy that's fixed from the sun that is available to other organisms. That's what's unique about primary producers, is they have the ability to capture energy from the sun, lock that energy up into molecules, and then that as those molecules get passed to other organisms, those molecules are broken open, and we can harvest that energy, and other organisms can use that energy to live. And so the primary producers are essential to the whole thing, right? Without those plants and other photosynthetic organisms capturing sunlight energy, there's no energy available to anyone else. So that's what's unique about them. Now, as that energy gets passed from one trophic level to another, we realize that we're usually limited. There's only a handful, there's not unlimited trophic levels, right? So for example, in our terrestrial food chain, we've got an herbivore that eats the plant, and then we've got a carnivore that eats that herbivore, and another carnivore, and then a third carnivore, but then that's it, right? You don't think of this red-tailed hawk or whatever kind of hawk this is, doesn't really have a predator. As humans, we don't really have predators, right? We can pretty much walk around campus and not be afraid. We don't have to worry about anything coming to eat us. Now, if you were a rabbit on campus, you'd be running and hiding, and you'd be very afraid because there are other predators that you could be eaten, that could eat you. Now, if we were in a different place, if you were out in the backwoods of Alaska or somewhere, yes, there are bears, there are some predators that can eat humans, but in general, we're kind of sitting at the top of that food chain. Well, why? How come there aren't predators that we're worried about? How come that this trophic web is limited in the number of levels that it has? It's because of energy. It's because there's only so much energy to go around. And every time you go up a trophic level, you lose about 90% of the energy. And that's just a rule of thumb, and it's not hard and fast, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. And so every time you compare an herbivore trophic level to the primary producers, you see that there's a lot less energy in the herbivores. And then if you compare that primary consumer to the herbivores, or the secondary consumer to the herbivores that it eats, you see that there's less energy. Every time you go up a trophic level, there's less and less energy available. And finally, there's just not enough energy to support another trophic level. Well, where does that energy go? As you go from one trophic level, that energy's got to go somewhere, right? The first law of thermodynamics says energy is neither created nor destroyed, it just changes form. Well, organisms need energy to live, right? And so that herbivore eats that plant, gets energy from that plant, but that herbivore has to use energy to make its heart beat, to breathe, to move around, to make nerves fire, things like that. And so then once that organism uses that energy to do something, well, that energy just turns into heat. That energy is no longer available for the next trophic level. And every time you have an energy transfer, a little bit of it turns into heat. That's the second law of thermodynamics. And so all energy transfers are inefficient. And so consequently, as that energy moves from primary producer to herbivore to carnivore, lots of that energy gets used by the organism and eventually degrades to heat. And so there's less and less and less available, and that limits the number of trophic levels. So consequently, as long as the sun is burning and we're able to capture energy, the whole process keeps running. But you can't have unlimited trophic levels because that energy all degrades down to heat. And so there's just not enough energy left to have more than 5 or 6 total trophic levels. And again, this is just rules of thumb. This is not hard and fast, but you get the idea. It's all about energy transfer. Now, that was what we call a food chain. Very simplistic, very linear. Real life, not that simple, right? You've got more organisms and it's more complicated, and it's more like a food web. It's branching. You've got organisms feeding at different levels. It's more realistic. It's more complex. And that makes it more fascinating. But the idea is still the same. So here's a figure from your book showing a food web, and you can see that the organisms eat other organisms, but are also eaten by other organisms. And it's not such a clear-cut multiple trophic levels, but the idea is still the same. You still have solar energy being captured by the primary producers, and then that energy flows through all these other organisms until all that energy degrades to heat. And that limits how many organisms you can have. Now, we talked about how all those relationships in that food web, for example, have been evolving for a long time, and they're very complicated. They're very tight relationships. And so by just removing one species, that can have effects that cascade throughout the entire community. And so you can remove or disrupt just a couple of species and radically alter, affect all the other species. So for example, what would happen if you removed the krill? If something happened to knock the krill out, right? Well, look at how many organisms feed on those krill. And so, the squid feeds on the krill. And so then if you don't have as much krill, then maybe the squid numbers drop. Or maybe the squid, they also eat zooplankton. So maybe the squid has to switch to zooplankton. So now you got fewer zooplankton. So you got rid of the krill, but you might end up getting rid of the zooplankton. Or the squid might not survive as well because they don't have as much food. And things that feed on the squid, like the penguins or the elephant seals, they might be indirectly affected. The point is there's many levers here, and by just moving or affecting one, you can have unintended consequences. Well, this is something that we see a lot and happens a lot when humans disrupt communities. And so, for example, here's a very simplistic Kentucky Lake food web, right? You've got primary producers, which are phytoplankton, small photosynthetic organisms that float in the water, and they're eaten by like zooplankton, which are small animals that live in the water, and then those are eaten by small fish and herbivorous fish, and then the small fish are eaten by bigger fish, and you got fish that feed at different levels, and so you've got this very complicated relationship, but that's a functioning aquatic food web, and all those organisms evolved to get their energy in that way. Well, like one of the big problems that we're working on here is this invasive silver carp. And this is why we're so worried about this invasive silver carp. This is not a native species. It came from Asia, and it feeds on phytoplankton and zooplankton. It feeds at the base of that food web, and they grow really quickly, and they're very prolific. They have lots of babies, and they grow so fast that there's no predators that can feed on them. There's nothing to control them, and they're not native, so native predators don't often see these things as food. And so you short circuit that food web. All that energy that normally flows through all these native zooplankton and small fish and big fish, that whole community can be disrupted by putting this one species in, because all that energy flows to this one species and nothing else eats it, and so the energy gets stuck in that species and is unavailable for all the native species. That's why we're really worried about this fish. But that's a point. That my point is that, you know, with adding a species or taking away a species, you can have these really tremendous cascading effects throughout that community. Now, humans do this a lot. Okay, we add a species, we remove a species, and the effects go way beyond that one species because of these tight relationships. And so messing with the wrong species can cause a catastrophe. And there are some species that have more pull than other species. And so we have things that we call keystone species. We have other species that we call ecosystem engineers. And the presence or absence of one of those species can have tremendous effects on the food web. So for example, keystone species have strong control. The classic study of this is with sea stars. And sea stars in an intertidal community can act as a keystone species. They have tremendous influence over other species. And so you look at this experiment where went over for several years, and they had areas where they left the sea stars in place, and other areas where they removed just the sea star. All they did was remove that top predator, that keystone species. And so if you look at this graph, it's got the number of species present each year in the control group and the experimental group. And you can see that just removing that one species actually ended up removing a tremendous number of other species. That's what happened. That's what a keystone species is. And so you've got, again, this is a simplified version of the food web that was in this intertidal community. You got several different species of algae that feed sponges and whelks, and then barnacles eat them and limpets eat them, and then the sea star eats all these other things. And so by removing the sea star, first off, you see that we're seeing, predation here, but also there's mutualism, there's parasitism, there's all those complicated relationships we talked about earlier are all sort of represented by these arrows. It's not just predator-prey. And when they removed that keystone species, in this experiment, when they removed that sea star, you saw all those other species disappear. This is the same thing we saw in that graph. What happened? Why did removal of one species end up removing a whole bunch of other species, right? Well, you remove that top predator, then the mussels and the limpets and the chitons are not as controlled, so there's lots more competition between them, and the mussels outcompeted those other species, and the barnacles as well, and so then they disappeared, and they were feeding on these other algae, and so you had more competition among the algae, and only one algal species ended up surviving. I don't know all the details, but the point is that by removing this keystone species, you actually ended up having a tremendous effect on this community. That happens a lot, and that's why we need to be careful about this. Another cool example, wolves and beavers. In Yellowstone National Park, this is another classic study. So, a lot of people question, why do we want to protect wolves, or why do we want to reintroduce something like a wolf? Aren't they dangerous? No, they're not really dangerous, but by having them there, they affect the rest of the community. And so in Yellowstone, wolves were first removed. And after the wolves were removed, it was noticed that lots of tree species disappeared. Well, what do wolves have to do with trees? Why did removing wolves end up also removing trees? Well, the wolves ate elk, right? When you remove the wolves, the elk populations explode. Elk eat the tree seedlings. And so many tree species dropped off because of this cascade through the trophic web. When wolves were reintroduced, the trees began to show back up. But the elk's numbers were not affected. That's crazy, right? But it's because the reintroduction of the wolves changed the behavior of the elk. And so the elk changed their behavior, stayed away from wolf dens, stayed away from the wolves, and in those areas then, the trees were able to grow back up because the elks were not eating the seedlings. My point is these fascinating, complicated relationships have been evolving for a long time. And humans tend to go in and just modify these communities in any way we want. But they're very complex, and you can't always predict what's going to happen. And we should value them for that complex relationship. And it's fascinating, and we should try to understand that. And by exerting this huge influence, we can have, by removing just a few species, we can have a huge influence on the rest of the community. Now, where do beavers come in? Return of these tree species ended up benefiting beavers and other species, right? Because of beavers. And so you think, by removing the wolves, you got rid of lots of other species. By keeping the wolves there, you actually were able to maintain higher species diversity. And so when people question, why do we want to reintroduce and protect these certain species? Well, this is why. Because that actually is the way the entire community evolved. Now, beavers are a good example of our other type of species with lots of influence, and those are ecosystem engineers. So ecosystem engineers are species that cause a physical change to the environment that influences the entire community structure. And so what do beavers do? Beavers build dams. And so beavers can dam up a stream, turn a stream into a lake, which can have a huge effect on the community there, right? You have a completely different set of species. And so you've got lots of species that might rely upon those beaver pools. And so if the beavers aren't there, then the beaver pools aren't there, then all kinds of other species get influenced or get affected. And so that's a good example of an ecosystem engineer, a species that physically changes the habitat that affects other species. Well, all these species in this community evolve together, and they count upon those ecosystem engineers. Another good example are gator holes. And so in Florida, you have these areas where they get pretty dry, but the gators dig these holes and they get down to the aquifer. They get down to the groundwater, and so you have these holes that end up being wet. And the gators do this because they need that wet water to survive the dry periods. But you've got these oases, these areas where you've got water because of the gator, and you got lots of other species, and they depend upon those gators. And so, again, why protect gators? Well, because lots of other species depend upon them because they're ecosystem engineers. So this is just another cool example. Now, who is the biggest ecosystem engineer? What species modifies habitats the most that has influence on other species? Well, it's us, right? So here's an example of mountaintop removal. Like this is, humans are the biggest ecosystem engineer. We go out and modify habitats at enormous levels. And it has, but the way we modify habitats doesn't have anything to do with how we evolved with the rest of the community. It has to do with other things, but it still has tremendous effects, but these are negative effects on the rest of the community. So you got something like this where you cut off the top of a mountain just to get at the coal. That's really going to radically influence a tremendous number of species. And so this is the point that I'm trying to make here, is that, these community level interactions are fascinating, complex, have been evolving for a long time. So they're precious for that reason. And they should be maintained, and we need to be careful when we go out and start modifying habitat and changing species and getting rid of species, because that's definitely going to affect other species in the community. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it right or wrong? Those are ethical questions that we need to talk about. I'm giving you the biology behind it. That's what fascinates me. And I think this is really interesting stuff. So, anyway, that's really all I've got for this topic. I'm just trying to give you an introduction to some of these things and show you the fascinating world of community ecology. As always, if you've got any questions, you let me know. And I'll see you later.